Okay, welcome. This is our fourth week of study, and so far we've been through quite a bit as far as the setup goes of the figure. So everything here should look relatively familiar. This is a couple of poses from drawings we've looked at. I just took the liberty of setting it up so that you wouldn't have to watch me go through the whole establishment phase again as we are starting to look at anatomy today. So it's going to be about building on top of what we have here. And so that's kind of where I want to place the emphasis. I am using a pose, though, that we've looked at before so that you can have that type of consistency. You can see it as it's developed from in the prior lectures, the gesture to the shapes, the landmarks, and then now with the anatomy on top. So if we give a brief description of what's here on your screen, I like to teach the way I understand anatomy through kind of little maps or diagrams, just so we can have a simple way of thinking through the shape and placement of each muscle. And so what we'll also do over here is just also, make a list so that we can find a way to agree on how we're studying this. So keep in mind that this should always first be done in sequence. I know it's exciting to get to anatomy, but still I don't think anatomy should be a part of the drawing until we have a reason for it. And remember, a gesture is the reason. The anatomy is just kind of like a miniature argument for what is the larger story. For example, it's the activity of the deltoid raising the arm. The arm is still the primary function of the drawing or the story. The anatomy is just kind of the micro, at least in the way that I see it. The second thing is landmarks. That's how we gave our drawings a spatial and skeletal reality. And then there were steps in between, so all of this is a lesson. All of that was a lesson. We did the head drawing, which was another way of thinking deeper into the technical side of landmarks, where we talked a lot about the additive and subtractive methods of form building. Remember, with head drawing, I made the analogy to the pencil being a knife, and we sliced off parts. That would be a subtractive way of thinking about the form. What we're adding, so today is an additive, is these shapes still. And that's stuff that I said from like the second week, that I would never introduce new volumes or ideas. I really am not. So anatomy is going to be one of these three or a combination, and today will be an additive process of building or stacking forms on top of what we already have. That will involve looking again at these concepts: T-overlap and wrapping lines. And I want to make it really clear today, as we talk about anatomy, that this is not going to be a clinical kind of investigation into the hard and fast facts of the anatomical makeup. Remember, on the very first week I talked about this as a practical type of bridge that I like to try to construct between what we know and how we make it actual. So it's very much practical oriented. So all of my anatomy and information on anatomy is kind of built from iconic shapes, but it's not meant to be a traditional kind of academic investigation into the human muscles and their makeup. I think there are a ton of great resources for that, and I don't necessarily think I'm qualified for that. So remember to look on the blog, because there's tons of references, and there's also a book list. And I'll use images from the book list today in the PowerPoint. So sorry for that. Anatomy. Today the way I'm going to break it down is, again, the division. Well, you have to know what's there. Right? So I'm going to do my best to give you an idea of the name, the function, where it goes, but more importantly, or just as importantly, the way that I draw it will be based from first thinking in terms of a shape. So you'll see, again, a lot of consistency in the way that the figures have been built up as well. The shape of the muscle is going to be an iconic shape. I'm always going to start with something general that can be remembered easily, and then build to a more specific state or quality. The second thing will be the gesture. In the shape, again, I'm Number one, I'm actually thinking again about its placement and position, so all those things that are easily identified and handled through shape. Gesture, the shape has to change. We see flex, stretch muscles, and those have to communicate what the action is doing. So, for example, I can't show every muscle flexed on the body if we're just sitting drinking a cup of tea. That's just kind of odd. So you need to have some type of relationship to your knowledge base of anatomy that allows for the artistic interpretation and or design. And then the third thing that's going to be incredibly important is the perspective. I want, again, to go back to our additive versus subtractive methods. The perspective of each anatomical part. Each anatomical part has its own perspective or volume that I want you to think about as an added quality that will go on top of the surface of what we've already developed. So it becomes a little bit more complicated today in that there's two issues at stake. One is the individual or the independent muscle perspective. The second is how that independent perspective relates to what is already there as a total. So, for example, the sternocleidoid mastoid has its own perspective, but I also have to show how it wraps around everything that already exists when I place it on top. And we did deal with that last week. So some of our, or a couple of our muscles that we do look at today as we work from the torso down will be review. Okay, so hopefully that is enough to be clear on how I'm going to be approaching this and what you can expect from today and your study of kind of the practical anatomy. I also kind of compiled a breakdown in the PowerPoint presentation of other images. So here is just a number of images that I have taken from books. Again, great authors on anatomy, and I highly recommend that you get their books. This is from Elliot Goldfinger. It's a book that I really enjoy. I think it's great. It does kind of already break up some of these issues and shapes as far as the anatomy goes. What you'll see is the in each of his plates, you'll see the skeleton with the insertion and then the origin. And here we're looking at the sternocleidoid mastoid. Then you'll see the muscle in context, and then the muscle photographically. Front view, side view, here we see the same thing. The sternocleidoid mastoid connecting behind the ear on the cranial mass, and then down to the manubrium, the top of the sternum, and slightly out the clavicle with a small flange that pulls out to the side of the muscle. So this is kind of hopefully to give you kind of a picture of the way that I think about these shapes and then interpret them for a drawing. Another drawing from this excellent author to look at is Gottfried Bammes, who is a German illustrator or anatomist. Very good one, very well respected, great books. Well, if you can find any of them, I highly recommend them as well. And I try to include in anatomy presentations that I'll give to help students a good mix. You don't want to put in a bunch of just clinical anatomical information. You also want to make sure that you look at artistic interpretation. So it's always good to look at your favorite artist and try to figure out how and why they've made the different choices they have. But if you remember, last week we talked about this muscle as the baseball bat shape. Again, if we're going to start to give a quick review of our process, which I just outlined, our 1, 2, 3, which was shape, gesture. So I'll write it over here. This is the way that I'm going to try to think anatomy for today. We'll spend a little bit more time on the sternomastoid because it's something that's familiar to us from last week. And then I'll try to pick up the pace a little bit with some of the other muscles. And I won't be as restrictive and make sure that you know where I am at every given stage. The iconic shape was the baseball bat, but remember, this is just a way to think the shape. It's not the way that the shape looks. This is me drawing it here kind of from a front view. Then we said that that's really not correct because there's an asymmetrical design in the muscle. So what would be a little bit more accurate and probably something that we're seeing here is how we have a high to a low. Or there's a subtle curvature there that suggests some of our principles from gesture. So if I were to want to start more iconically, because I'm having my first run through on this process, using the most simple shape would be preferable, like the baseball bat. But as I start to get more confident, going into something that's more organic is not a bad idea. And even more so than this, the small kind of flange that we'll see pulling off to the side and grabbing onto the clavicle, leaving this small hole, fossa, in between. So that's our shape. Right? It's the way that I design the shape. Now to think about a gesture. The gesture is going to be no different than how we've talked about gesture as being C or S curve, or especially as we've discussed it in our connection areas. Pinch and stretch. The muscle will do the same thing. So if this muscle helps with turning the head, or if it's used simultaneously, both on either side, bowing the head, I need to identify the stretch and the pinch to equate the activity with the correct design. So one thing that may be helpful is if you could think about a line of action, a straight line that might organize where the muscle begins and ends. So think about that as connecting the dots, essentially. And try to make a practical connection with how the muscles work as pinching, which will bring those two closer together, or stretching, which will allow for them to create distance between. And then I'll design the concept of S or C into that. So if I have my line of action, now the muscle is being used, so I know that these 2 points are being pulled closer together. It also means that I have to change my shape. So we talked about this. So my shape is going to get shorter and fatter. And the stretched would be the opposite. My shape will get thinner and elongated. So that's my basic premise for how I'm working. Of course, those are exaggerated examples. The last is a perspective, and we talked about this as being modified from a basic cylinder. And so that's the perspective that I would give it, and as I add it on to my landmarks model, this is going to be the type of perspective that I think. This is going to change. Right? The volume of a muscle changes as the perspective, or I'm sorry, as the gesture becomes something different. So that's something I want to be especially sensitive to. Okay, so let's take a quick break from this, and we'll move back to the Photoshop portion and just design this so that we can have a frame of reference. The mastoid, as we've talked about it, in the front does create some of those triangular shapes. So what I want my map to be here is just a two-dimensional model. Right, so it's a way to remember patterns, iconic shapes. I use it as a map indicating those graphic shapes or divisions of borders or boundaries, something that will help me remembering. Right? It's something that I kind of keep in my mind as I'm drawing, and then I study or look for difference. Remember we said that this is something that allows us to see a series of triangle patterns. So I have the big triangle coming down from behind the ear. I then have the flange that's pulling off to either side. If it helps you, you can think of this maybe as an M that exists down in the lower portion, going to the clavicle, going to the manubrium. Okay, that's just another way of building here. I can remember the muscle, and then I can remember the muscle in a context that's more of a kind of design or simple suggestion. And if we put it now on top of our model, right? So as we look at this, I'm seeing the sternocleidoid mastoid here, and then pulling out. I would say that's the flange from behind the ear, and then we see the volume of the muscle ending in the tendon down into the top of the sternum. So there's our muscle shape. I would say, and I'm going to exaggerate that, as stretched in our design. And here it's coming from around, and obviously more pinched. So the interpretation of that here, I'll look for my 2 points, so, or in this case, or any case 3 if there is. I can set it up with that line of action. This is just to prevent any type of poor design, right? It just helps to have, I think, a straight line that you can build off of. Here it's coming from the other side, and I'm thinking about it up here somewhere. And then on top I'm going to design or articulate the shape. Here's an S curve, because I really want to push the idea that this is stretched, and I've pushed in perspective this head much more so than we have. I've done a few things to adjust the pose for some effects in the muscles. I've also brought this arm back. So then here's our other side, coming from behind the jaw. And then that's our shape. So we'll fill it in. So just think of this almost like adding, in a drawing sense or in a practical sense, like drapery. It is laying on top of all of the surfaces already existing, and as it does that, it needs to conform or mold itself to those existing surfaces. If we get a little bit closer, we can kind of take a look at what some of the perspective of this muscle would be doing. So a couple of things I have to keep in mind here at this point. One that we already talked about last week is how the muscle negotiates the actual neck. So remember we said that the muscle, or any muscle that starts around, has to hit a volume, take on its perspective, and then it can kind of return to its own state of normalcy. At least that's the illusion that we're trying to depict. So that's one thing I want to think about, and that's a wrapping line issue and a T overlap issue. Here, same thing. Wrapping to the back of the head, kind of overlapped and under. Out. And the perspective is that it's pulling back. So I want to see this as a cylinder that's wrapping and connecting prospectively a space that here, even if it's nominal, is nearer to us, and even if it's a matter of inches, this is a space that's now further away. So I'm going to try to show that with the perspective or wrapping lines on the muscle proper. And clavicle, this part would be overlapped, around, and then down and in. And then we talked about very briefly some of the muscles here last week. Okay, so that would be our first muscle, and hopefully you get the process. And what we'll do now is start to go through some more of the surface anatomy, and I promise I will be less particular about trying to continue to explain this to you, and just now address the muscle, or each muscle individually, while trying to design it and give some kind of organic qualities to the figure. So that's what we'll do now. The next muscle that we're going to cover is going to be the pectoralis. So this is a muscle that most everyone is comfortable and familiar with. This is a muscle that we'll see and have probably seen, if you're a fan of comics, very easily on the surface, generally made to be overly massive with tons of garden hose-like veins underneath the surface. All stuff that you may want to avoid for a more traditional study, but nonetheless a muscle that's pretty easy to find and visible on the surface. So here we have a couple illustrations. So you can get a sense for what would be on one side the pectoralis major and minor on the right, the muscle under. This is not something that we're going to see as readily, obviously, but something that will affect surface change, in that it does tend to push out the major, or we do see the influence of the minor beneath. So in the pectoralis major, what we're studying is a muscle that's going to be working the humerus or pulling the humerus in or towards the sternum, forward towards the kind of the front of the body. It's going to be a muscle that has three origins. We have in this muscle a clavicular attachment. We have a sternal attachment, and then we have at the very bottom the abdominal portion. We also have this little tail here. We're going to see this tail attaching to the tendinous fibrous wall around the abdomen, or of the abdomen. So we have 1, 2, and then here 3. 3 parts of the muscle that you can see also have in their design a little bit of an overlap. So try to think of these or look at these as triangles. I think it's going to be an easier way to kind of think through the division of the muscle. If all of them are originating on the clavicle, sternum, fifth rib of the rib cage, we're going to see them all inserting into the point of the humerus. And so kind of collectively in this area. And that's going to be roughly about a third of the way down the humerus. We'll eventually see it kind of covered over by the deltoid. So what we'll also see is some of this design change as the muscle unfolds. And so here's going to be the second. Notice that this is overlapping under the first and progressively moving higher as an attachment. Right, so this is pulling up as the muscles move down, their attachments get higher. And then we see all of this tucking under and then pulling very high. So that's the basic structure and makeup of the muscle. Here's the Goldfinger view, so you can get a little bit more of a kind of clear interpretation of where those points of connection are. Clavicular, sternal, and then the abdominal portion along the fifth rib there, and then the connection point to the humerus. Here would be again to kind of come in and fill in the shape, and this is what I like about Goldfinger, is that we can really kind of try to think about how to play around with abstraction, or taking what's given and then interject some type of artistic interpretation. So those are our 3. We can see the muscle there isolated and then in context. So you can see how we have our sternomastoid above. This is attaching to the clavicle. Then we're going to have the deltoid and trapezius, one muscle we talked about last week, around it. On the photographic view, I think we could see here some of those striations really well. And then the side view. So important for the development of form and process in our drawing is that this is a muscle that stays on the front plane. So remember, if we've developed our perspective of this torso from the thoracic arch developed up, that's our plane. Then one thing that you can notice is the pectoralis leaves the front plane right at our corner and then starts its passage there to the humerus. So really important that you try to make sure that you understand where the forms are placed, because otherwise you're going to have a pectoralis on the side of the rib cage, which just isn't appropriate for this study. It may be appropriate for a character that you have, but then you would need this kind of background and form to bring that character to life. So again, this would be our side plane, which would separate that. This is from an interesting book called The Visual Human Project that is accompanied by a DVD. It just gives kind of a more 3D depiction of the muscles, which I think are interesting to supplement out some of the more kind of diagrammatic illustrations that we have. And here you can see the pectoralis minor, the attachment to the ribs, the sternum, and then here we have the pectoralis and the different views, or the heads portions. changing. Right? So we talked about shape, we talked about design, and now we want to talk about the gesture. Here we have our normal gesture. So one way I'll think about this muscle to make it even more simple or general and to build in another goofy iconic shape is it looks like a goldfish without a head. And so here's our tail, and I'm thinking about how the muscles again are overlapping. I guess the head would be over here. So our fish. And this is going to be, again, just built from that idea of the separations. This would be more of a pinched or neutral state. Right? So I want to show that pinch kind of coming in, and you can see that what will happen here is when the arm raises, and so we have a lift in the arm here, that these different component parts are unraveling or stretching. So instead of having this crossing, which develops a unique quality of form here, it's all going up and to at that point of connection or the insertion. And so we get a different type of design. All of the striations run kind of more to that point instead of overlapping. And then also look. And so what Gottfried Balmas has showed us here is that this S-curve, which is important, right? Because it kind of takes some of the originality out of what I'm saying, which is good, because I can show you a point of common usage. Here, this is arguably much more C in nature. So C and S, even in the kind of breakdowns of wonderful illustrations by Gottfried Balmas. Okay, so let's take and build this into our model and go through a drawing process based on what we have or picked up as far as knowledge and exercise some editing and design. Okay, so I'm going to build it first onto our map so that we can remember and refresh what are some of those basic concepts of the shape and how to place it, or at least this just may be a way to think about how to organize. So pectoralis, if we think to the side our shape, I'm going to go with the goldfish. That being said, we can make this gendered or female just by adding on a shape. So the breast is going to sit under and then over. So we'd have an overlap here and then an overlap here. So it's just another modification with adding a form. So attachment, up for the clavicular portion, down for the sternal, across the fifth rib. Here I'm just going to bring the muscle around to show both sides. This is where that side plane would be, so I know it's going to end there, and then it's pulling here. So I don't think this is a bad idea. Because you worked so hard on the stage prior to this and developed out landmarks, if you can come back in and find those landmark points, I think it's really going to help take some of the difficulty off of placing the muscle. As all you're going to have to do is connect the dots. So here's my pectoralis shape, my goldfish, just kind of modified to sit here. You can use rhythms to find the other side if you can place one. I think it's really good to develop a rhythmic relationship of the muscles on the other side. Here we have the arm raised, but let's, for example, just say that it was to be at the side. I'll generally do one on this downswing and then find a relationship here, and then the same thing for the top. And I feel the movement of the pectoralis over to the other side. And I think that gives us a nice rhythm-based relationship. So there's our shape and its placement. You can tell I'm a big fan of color coding things. The only problem with that is that some of my diagrammatic lectures end up looking like they're odd, multicolored acid trip figures. Okay, this side is going to change because the gesture. So we have now the muscle going here. And because it's going to the front, it's behind, right? Because we're not seeing the front of the arm. So that means I'm going to have to utilize an overlap. So here's my S, raising, and then over and behind. And then this is going to be built more from S curves. So that's just my basic redesign. But what we've tried to do with exacting some reference imagery and knowledge is present a set of possibilities, and then kind of limit the possibilities with the shape and design. To be a little bit more specific now for the perspective, we can look at our larger figure. And here we have, you can see, the pectoralis on this side is raising. So that's this area. You can kind of see a half tone in between the muscles, which would be at the area of the sternum, and then here. So again, we have like our map, a stretch, and then a pinch. This is pulling over, up, and then down. So that's where we would find our pectoralis. This side is stretched. So what I want to use the model to do, or the landmarks drawing, is to just show the perspective a little bit more. Because here we have shape, gesture, and now let's do let's talk about volume more so. So here, again, I've pushed the arm out so we see a little bit more. Find coming down. I always want to start to kind of think about where it's starting, which is the clavicle, sternum, and then across the fifth rib. What I'm going to do differently here is make sure this feels planar. And I want when I indicate the shape, to have it feel like it's already existing in perspective. And again, that's going to be a matter of looking at the landmarks and then also respecting the volumes that are already there. Then I'm going to connect them. Connect the dots essentially with, in this case, S curves. So here is our S, and then let's fill this in. What we probably see in this muscle is because of the change in the gesture, now the perspective has become different. It's thinned, elongated. There's no longer the mass that exists kind of more towards the nipple line. It's redistributed and higher. On this side, we'll do the same thing. Connect the dots. Here's our areas of landmark. I moved the arm back here, right, like I already mentioned. So that means that instead of a stretch here, we'll probably have a little bit more of a stretch here. So I want to tie this back with S. And then this coming down. And we will not have here an overlapping, an unraveling like we have in this stretch view. So there's my clavicular, sternal, and abdominal sections. All right, and now let's give a little bit better of an idea of the overlaps and perspectives. So here's our attachment points. And what I like to think about as far as the development of form in this muscle is that from a static position, so not in this one where it's stretched, the muscle to me is much more like a box. So if we take a look at the pectoralis shape, which we've designed there as shape, I'm going to think more in terms of it having a box at the bottom. And so here we're really starting to get planes. And this is where you're going to start to see some of the mass for that muscle developing, maybe just right in line with the nipple line there. And then you can modify it as you see. This part suggests kind of more of a cylindrical design as it starts to pull in towards the shoulder. but that will always be my next step. So here I'm starting to look for some of those overlaps, how the muscle is connecting and wrapping, and then if I can establish a plane. Oops. So now this would be our top, side, and then we're onto our form. So I think this is a good step to go through when you're first learning, just to really start to feel out how the muscles are developed in perspective on top of what you have. So this is top, this is now bottom, and then we're onto our rib cage under. How does that change in this one? It's going to be pulled up and then localized towards that stretch. Okay, so that's our pectoralis major that we've worked from design into the perspective rendition on top of our model there, with some ideas for how the gesture is being developed and taken into account. So next we'll go into the serratus. The serratus is going to be a muscle that we'll see right underneath and behind. So let's talk about that next. The serratus is also, again, kind of a comic book muscle. It's one of those muscles that we are definitely going to see beneath the surface and tends to get wildly exaggerated in some or many comics. And I'm going to skip down to that one first so we can take a look at it and include that, and then we'll jump to the deltoid. So the serratus anterior excuse me, is going to connect to the first to the 8th or 9th rib, and is a larger kind of fleshier mass. Where it's going to be starting is a little bit more difficult. It's going to be inserting under the scapula. So that's what this arrow here is indicating, is that from the back we're not going to see the insertion. The origin is going to be relatively clear, right, because we can see it here, and you can see how that would appear on the surface. The insertion again is underneath, right? So here's our scapula on the back, and it's connecting to the front of that. So we're not going to be able to identify with the insertion. It's mostly going to be visible from the side, but you can also see how the kind of the fleshier mass of this muscle is kind of pushing through and making itself visible on the latissimus, as it's either thinning out and stretching here, or just from that normal kind of static position without the arm there. So as we put this one in, that's what I'm going to try to base my design from. The muscles that are visible, which are maybe these 3 to 4, and developing some type of sphere that will take into account the kind of the fleshier mass. This is going to be a muscle that will counter your rhomboid, a muscle that's helping to pull the scapula in towards the spine. This does the opposite. If the rhomboid is attaching here, so you're going to see a design kind of like this. This is pulling scapula up and in. This is helping pull the scapula forward or onto the side of the rib cage. So let's create a design for this in our kind of anatomical language or dictionary that we're building, and then we'll take a look at the deltoid. So serratus, let's come up first and archive our shapes, our shape here, how we'll see it, starting from the back. So the serratus here from the back, and let's make sure that we get another layer so that you could piece through some of this stuff if you need. Overlapping. Right, so that's one of the first most important things, is that from this view we're not going to see much of what's going on. So I'm going to show it under and then again under, or rather over, I guess. Lots of prepositions. Here under and then stretching. So I'm going to thin it and push more of that S design. This is from the back going to get covered up by latissimus, so it's going to be a little bit clouded or hidden. And then let's talk about from the front. So if this is our archive of shapes, from the front, I kind of like to think of it just as a sphere that has the kind of the claw hands, or this would be the serrated quality. So think of like a serrated knife. This is the quality to the muscle, and here it's kind of fitting in between the ribs. There's, again, from the 1st to the 8th or 9th rib, so we're going to have, again, that will change. This is designed based on what's visible to me. So here it's going to be under, coming from behind, sitting here, right underneath. This does not go to the front plane. So a lot of the times what I'll use the serrated edge of the muscle to do is articulate where that corner is. Here, same thing, except now it's stretching. So if this, sometimes I'll make the analogy that looks kind of like a hand. Think about two hands that are kind of grabbing right to the side and under the pectoralis on either side. So I'm doing my best to take all of the, I guess, the prestige out of anatomy by making things into dead goldfish or mutant green hands grabbing the rib cage. But hopefully there's enough there that's somewhat memorable in my torturing of the subject that it'll be able to be a little bit more common usage in your drawings and maybe a little bit more approachable. So that's our shape. It gives us our basic gesture, because here I have an S and then I have a C. And then let's put it onto our larger model, and we'll take a look at how it contributes to perspective. Okay, probably not going to get a whole lot here. I guess we could maybe make the argument that we see just a small hint of the muscle, but not enough to really cause that much form change or surface change. On this side I think we will get more. So we're going to see it, we just kind of ghost in our shapes here, and then connecting in the ribs. Remember, side plane has to maintain. So I think that we could say it's this shape. And that's what I'm going to build. I'm going to build with that in mind. Same way we did in the map. So first, big general shape, which is just a modified ellipse or egg. And that's our additive process. I just sculpted that on. And then here's the fingers fitting in. And now let's be a little bit more specific with some of these shapes and the overlap points. So I'm going to put this behind and then in front of the rib cage. Here's my 3. I tend to use 3 or 4, and here I tried to kind of organize them on that diagonal so that they'll encourage the viewer's eye up and over. Now the form. Let's again come back to this stage where we start to look at what we've added. If this is a separate piece, now this has become something that is built in on top of the rib cage, which is now that much lower surface under. And I think what this will help you do now is if you invent a lot of poses or positions or people that receive lighting, breaking these into maybe the most basic of shapes and objects can help you to position a light source just about anywhere. And also hopefully to get a little bit better sense for the design aspect. And that's our stratus. So, right, so it would be going all the way back to the scapula. And I guess on our larger figure down here, we would also see it, but it's going to be covered by some of the other muscles that we'll be discussing. So I think if we can just leave it as is on the map for now, it'll be fine. Okay, so that being done, let's take a look now at what we have next to the deltoid, which will be our pectoralis, the deltoid, first in slide form, and then we'll add it to this. What we'll be doing this week is trying to make it from here to here. So I still want to go over the deltoid, and then I'd like to end this week with the trapezius, just because I think it's a lot for 1 week to do the whole torso, and then next week we'll be able to spend more time just thinking about the muscles of the trunk, and then we can break up the limbs that way as well. A week on the upper portion, and then on the lower portion, upper leg, upper arm, lower arm, which will probably not leave us time for the hands and feet, but we can always do that or try to fit it in somewhere along the line. Okay, so moving on to the deltoid. Deltoid muscle is going to be one of the larger abductors that we have for the upper torso and the arm. And here's a view from Goldfinger. The origin point for the deltoid is going to be the clavicle. You can see the clavicle in the front, and it's also going to be to the medial portion or middle, the chromium process or the scapula, as it turns around to the front clavicle or clavicular portion, and then into the back or the scapula itself, which you can see at the bottom. So really important muscle for the kind of the operation of our arm. For the deltoid, what we're going to start to think about is a number of things. First of all, the deltoid in the front, to be a little bit more specific, is covering the outer quarter section of the clavicle. So again, if it's helpful for you to break this into 4 parts, this would be the last quarter that this front head is taking over. And every portion or head is pulling down to the insertion, which is on the outside of the humerus, right there. And another thing is you want to avoid perfect symmetry in the muscle. We really don't ever see this between the sides. So what you see here is something that's kind of very specific to the muscle, the structure. In the center especially, this is a multi-pennant section. Right? So it's makes for a very irregular striation and flow within the muscle, but primarily or only in the lateral head. So something that you're not going to have to worry about as much as in the other ones. But it just kind of looks like this leaf or overlapping leaf section here. The striations, generally if they're running from origin to insertion, like we saw in the pectoralis, that's not going to be the case in a bipennant or multi-pennant muscle. So again, to make this into a manageable shape, what I'll try to do from the front is just kind of give it a triangle-based shape, not unlike the one we used for our profiles on the head. And so something like that, which I'll also use for the back. The reason I can use these comfortably from front or back is that this is enveloping 2 basic egg shapes. So it's just kind of the proximal, which is front, the middle, and then the distal. I see in the back or the front either the proximal in the middle or the distal in the middle. From the side, I'll use a very different, well, not very different, but slightly different shape, which is just more of a regular triangle shape, where I see the middle, proximal, and distal. I very rarely ever use striations. I mean, if I do start to work with the modeling or the rendering, then it's something that you would have to take a look at. But for the most part, it's not something that I'll spend a lot of time thinking about in the drawing process. Important for the back is that we do have a section of tendon, or a big tendinous attachment relating the distal head. So you can see that here. So there's this big tendinous portion that's connecting the distal head and then allowing this muscle to kind of swing out again to that attachment. So while they all share different or three separate origins, they're commonly relating to the insertion and abducting the arm, or taking it away. So like aliens abduct you, the prefix there is important to help us remember what's taking place within the muscle. It's removing the muscle from the limb from the body. So we have a abduction. Here's a few by Goldfinger, again to show you the shapes and then how the muscles are being gestured or designed to communicate. Again, the abduction, or the arm away to the side, shows the C curve of the head. What's going to be challenging is that our arm can move in those three different positions because of the clavicle and scapula. So we want to make sure that we show a correct gesture or action for the part of the muscle that's doing it. And what I mean by that is here we have the arm moving forward, or the humerus moving forward. So we have a clearer C curve for the proximal and middle, as we have a forward and then kind of a raise. Here we see this is almost entirely stretched, that distal head. So you do want to try to be really clear on how you're showing the gesture of each shape working with the action. Here we again just kind of have the same view as this. We have the C curve, so the lift, and then here we have the stretch. Okay, and then we're back to serratus. So let's take a look at the deltoid and design it out, and then that'll leave us really one more to do for this week, which will be the trapezius, and one that we've already kind of worked with. And again, for homework, really try to focus on the overall. Get the whole thing down. Right? So, like I said at the beginning of the lecture, the muscles aren't just independent. They're sexy and everybody loves to draw them, but they should be in the service of that larger pose, or kind of creating focal points or arguments for the position of the figure. So every week for homework, you're doing 25 of these. Start out with the entire figure, right, the whole thing, and then see if you can rationalize, after the perspective has been built, how the muscles are supporting it. Okay, so we already gave a few shape suggestions for the deltoid. The deltoid from the side is going to be my profile-like shape. It's going to be our cap to the arm. This is going to be, front or back. And then side will be more of the broadened. So here, this is going to apply. When I put this, I'm going to leave this area, or a small triangular separation, to show the fossa. It's called the interclavicular fossa, above and below. We have a space here. So another design that we can use. Right? It's kind of like a triangular design element. And then we are going to see the proximal head coming out, and then the middle or lateral head attaching here. Simple shape. Let's say that this is starting to be picked up a little bit. So maybe we're starting to see a C. And I'm going to swing this curve over, and it's going to cover the attachment area of the pectoralis. So this is going to cap the arm and not really allow for that to be seen at all. So there's our deltoid shape. Let's also do that on the back. I'm thinking here about that tendinous attachment, and then I'm going to pull this out. I'm thinking about the attachment point being roughly halfway down, and then here's our curved shape. And now the other arm. So here we're going to have the deltoid covering. We still have to have it cover the perspective and shape of the pectoralis Too many P's in that sentence. I almost lost it. So this is going to be a C curve. It's raising. And then I'm going to think about how this is over and attaching to the clavicle, right, which is still in here, raising. So we're going to see shape. So still built from the basic idea of this iconic shape here. It's just that it's pinched. And then from this view, I might see the middle. So individually, these are all kind of teardrop shaped muscles. The proximal. And then here's the distal. Swinging out. And then up. So here you can see my S curve for the back, and then C curves more so for the front. So there's my shapes, and now let's build them out in perspective. And I think it's pretty easy on this one to see that we're not going to get a shape behind the head. So what I'm looking for is this. Here's our fossa. It's a triangle shape as we work our way across in this design. And then I know I'm going to have the proximal here. And then this, as we're kind of turning the corner, so to speak, to the back, would be the middle, the multi-pennant muscle, and then, I don't know, maybe we slightly see some of the distal coming from the back there. So that would be our shape. And that's actually really important, the way that I'm trying to address the turn of the perspective. So we'll talk about on the arms how this can be kind of conceived as a different structure, but I do try to maintain a sense of this as a box. As the straight lines, kind of how we've already talked, will give a texture that's different from some of the softer ones, which will be muscles. But I also want to just make sure this doesn't get too indistinct for a perspective. It also sets up the beginning of the cylinder. It's consistent, this box idea, with the cylinder. They're showing the same perspective. So if I can use the muscle to reinforce this, it's going to be a way that I can make sure the viewer is aware of it as a perspective. Fossa. So here's my triangle. And then this, again, I've moved the arm back. So I'm going to say that this one would be more stretched and halfway. So this is where I want to show the wrapping line as being very clear, because when I attach the line or the muscle to this, I want it to, again, tell the viewer this part, so the viewer gets the idea that it's wrapping. Make it move it up a little bit. So connection, overlap, wrapping line. Here's that proximal, and then the middle. And then I'm trying to get a little bit more C curve as we move back, just to show the motion. So there's our shape. Now we've added that volume into the structure that we've already developed. And so let's give it a light color treatment so that we can separate it out from other things that we've done. And there we could still see kind of the pectoralis in there. So I really have focused on making the deltoid planar in the sense of making the three heads represent three planes. And I think that's important for now, or until you get comfortable. It's always that process of beginning the general and then coercing it into a more organic conception of what it is you're seeing. And then we'll still see our top, just the top here to the clavicle, and then ending up here. So that's our deltoid. And let's be a little bit more specific here with our overlaps. Again, I just want to do one more for this week, and then I'd like to be able to go over some homework with you having done just this much, so I can help you to this point and give you some feedback based on what you've done. And then what we'll do for the week following is to finish the lower section. That way you're not kind of overwhelmed or bombarded by too much information, and we can make the skill building aspect of form, perspective, and gesture be kind of more of a privileged role. Okay, so the last one we'll take a look at then will be the trapezius. We jump back to our PowerPoint. The trapezius is going to be something that we've already talked about, so this will be a good end for our review in the sense that we are ending with something that we're already somewhat familiar with. So this is our trapezius, and again I'm back to my Goldfinger book, which I consider to be pretty invaluable. The trapezius is another hero muscle of the upper back. Again, that's one of those ones that always gets a lot of attention in comics and similar types of works. It's something that we start out being very familiar with. And we have a muscle here that is really important to the movement of our scapulas and as it attaches to the areas of the spine, head, and scapula. Okay, so again, the origin points being the spinuous process or top of the spine. Here's the long connection point for this muscle. This muscle is going to end in a long tendinous tail that's going to hit the last thoracic vertebrae. So you can kind of see that here, right, that idea, which means that a lot of the muscle volume will be a little bit higher than its actual connection. It's inserting into the end of the scapula, or the top portion here. We're going to see it come to the front, side, and then to the spine, right, or this section here of the scapula. So that's how I'm going to be developing my shape. You can see inside that we have this kind of tendinous separation around what would be the 7th cervical vertebrae. Right, so when we talked about our shape, and we'll talk about it again as the dagger, we made the analogy. When we talked about our shape, and we'll talk about it again as the dagger, we made the analogy for memory purposes that this was kind of like a blade in the handle. And if we haven't talked about that, I'll be sure to bring it up again. There's some nice rhythms that you can find in the striation of this muscle. And let's take a look at that real quick, as it's something I'll tend to use occasionally. Here, the way that the trapezius starts to move around the corner of the medial portion of the scapula, you can get some interesting tendinous rhythms, or striation rhythms based on the muscle. So we see the striations pulling from that point, almost like spokes on a wheel, all the way up. So kind of keep that spoke wheel design in mind there, and then we'll see that kind of start to change as the tendons will begin to move up and into the head. So again, striation or muscle striation isn't my primary concern. As you can tell, I'm much more focused on the development of form and gesture, but it's something nonetheless that will be important for stages past what we're discussing, where you start to render or give a more kind of realistic conception of the organic details of the muscle surface. The shape that I use in total for this, again, is the dagger shape. So let's take a look at that on our larger screen, I think, or on our Photoshop screen. I think that's all that we need to cover here. Again, I've just provided or Goldfinger's provide the front view and side view. Okay. So we've talked about this muscle as a dagger, and I think it's another interesting way to remember the shape. It's another piece for our shape archive, which we've kind of littered around our maps. I think of it like this, that it has this column. Here's the movement down into the top of the scapula. It moves down the scapula. And then, as we discussed in our symmetrical view, that it has this tendinous tail that ends at the thoracic portion of the spine. And diamond cut out in the handle so that we can remember that it's kind of moving around the 7th cervical vertebrae. Okay, that's the shape. What it means, though, is that the gesture is going to be dependent or tied to the way that the scapula are moving. And one way that you could try to alleviate a lot of difficulty in observation for figuring out what's going on is I'll look at the medial border of the spine or of the scapula and how it makes a type of M with the tail for the trapezius. That M could be pinched, in which case the scapula would be moved backwards towards the spine, which is an indication that our arms have moved backwards, pinching, and so we're going to see a different type of connection or pinch in here. I could have the M stretch, in which case the scapula have been pushed onto the sides of the rib cage by the arms moving forward, hence the intersection here would be stretched. So that's how I'm going to start to think about the muscle. So if we put this idea of a shape onto the back, here's where it's starting. Here's how it's pulling. Again, we can change this line to mean either male or female. Right? You can also play with the gesture of the shape to create gender. Again, females are going to have a more elegant shoulder line that's lower, while men will have something that's higher or more angular. And so here's how we're fitting in on this side. So that's our color, and then we can always take a look at the striations. And this side we have differences. So here I have the arm raising. So it's going to mean that this side is going to pinch. Now I have a C curve because I have the scapula moving up. So that's having to pinch. And then because this has moved away, now I'm going to get more of an S. So always just look for the placement of your landmarks, and then from there address the logical conclusion by having things nearer or closer together. I'm sorry, nearer or farther. From the front, we're going to see the overlapping of the shapes, trapezius, behind, sternomastoid, behind neck. So we're going to develop some designs for that in our front. So here what I'm going to be looking for is, again, this part. So how it's pulling up. I want to get the overlap behind the volume of the neck, and then how it's pulling. So we'll get this piece. This is raising, so it's going to be pinched. So this is definitely going to have to be more of a C curve in here. One thing that I like to look for in this area is how we have a nice, consistent gestural rhythm between the trapezius and deltoid in the front. So this is, I think, a really nice, powerful rhythm that can help you kind of connect those two across the clavicle. If you kind of think of that with the one that we talked about with the pectoralis, I think you'll have some nice cohesive rhythms and muscle connections in the upper portion here. Let's work with our trapezius on the back. I think you could see it pretty well here. We have a stretch. In this area, and then it's kind of folding over on itself in the front. So let's lay that in. Again, it's going to the base, the cranium. And so I want to show that overlap. Again, I've pushed this guy a little bit more. So show the S curve in front of the deltoid. I'm going to reinforce the perspective that the deltoid's given us based on the shoulder structure, and then I'm going to have this come in across on the clavicle. This is then going to pull back. Let's see if I can find a nice rhythm. So here's my rhythm with the deltoid, just to create a nice kind of flow there, and then up. And then this area, this broader section, would be filled in with other muscles, like your levator scapulae or scalenus muscles are going to pass through here. And so let's fill this in. and I think we get a good sense in the way it's laid in for the wrapping lines. Or without the wrapping lines, we can see some of the overlaps and some of those important perspective considerations. So let's tie it now onto our back view, just so we can have a well-modeled or thought-out position for the muscle. Starting here, this is my landmark for the muscle. Over here. So if it helps to go ahead and do that, then by all means, I don't think it's a bad idea at all. And now we'll connect the muscle shape. So essentially here connecting the dots. But I'm going to try to be conscious of what I see the landmarks doing as I move through. So here the arms push back, scapula is closer to the spine, and you can see here that there's a little bit of a half tone, which indicates to me that the muscle is pinched. And so here's our, we would see a volume change there, or at least a gesture to our shape, which would be a C curve or a pinch. Then let's tie this to the head. So it's going to broaden here, obviously, but then start to thin as it's moving up into the head, into kind of more like column-like or cylindrical forms. So that side's attached. This would be our diamond cut out, kind of a round. And then this is pushed out, and so you can see the inside there of the scapula, or the scapula turning away. And so what that means is that on this one, I would say that it's a little bit more stretched. So I'm going to make the S curve a little bit clearer as an indication for the muscle there. Up. And now as the arm is lifted, I would say that this is more of a pinch. So we have a C. Okay, so let's go ahead and fill it in. And now we've just kind of gone through a little bit more of an analytical process to situate that muscle and kind of rest it on top so that it matches perspective and or landmark. And then the last part, what we could do is just kind of come around and make sure those things are tied down by double checking our overlaps and such. So here, a lot of volume here. So where we're going to see a lot of form developing is shoulders. You can kind of treat this as a cylinder that's moving from the arm up into the head. And the game, or the idea, is to just make sure that you're observing the changes in form based on the activities. So as this has gotten a little bit more pronounced from the pinched, maybe we see this volume having kind of increased a bit. Falling off. And this would be thinner because it's stretching. And obviously here we already kind of pointed to the idea that this could be pinched, so maybe that means this is a different type of volume. Okay, so that is our trapezius. The last thing that we could maybe point out that might be helpful is how this leaves us with some areas of concavity around the neck that I think are useful for placing. So you have one here in between the trapezius and sternomastoid, one in between the flange, one at the pit of the neck, repeated on the other side, and then the fossa between the pectoralis and deltoid. If this were down, we'd have another one. Is 7 in total. So there's 7 areas of kind of these fossa area or concavities that I think give you really nice kind of anti-landmarks in the sense that they're recesses into the surface. And I'll kind of help to find these or use these as I place the muscles, just to make sure that if I'm observing a figure, I haven't gotten too crazy or out of whack with the proportions or muscle placement. So that's kind of the first run through the anatomy. It's the first lesson based on the muscles of the upper torso, the larger surface muscles. For homework, I would prefer to see you just kind of working with these, so that we can see how, or I can see how you're doing just with the muscle lay-ins on top of the existing perspectives. And then next week we'll spend some time looking at the area of the torso, abdomen, oblique, and then look at the spinal muscles on the back and the latissimus, right, so that we kind of make every lecture or discussion manageable by not exceeding 5 to 6 muscle shapes. Okay, so thanks for your attention, and next week we'll talk about that lower section.